More than 20,000 people inside Madison Square Garden rose to their feet before a single note had been played. It was June 10th, 1972. Outside, thousands of fans still crowded the streets of Manhattan, hoping for one last glimpse of the man newspapers called the King of Rock and Roll. Inside, every seat was filled. The stage shimmered beneath golden lights while members of the TCB band quietly checked their instruments. Security guards lined the barricades, knowing that Elvis Presley concerts could become chaotic within seconds. The audience chanted in perfect rhythm, "Elvis, Elvis, Elvis." Backstage, however, the man they were calling for stood alone. Elvis Presley stared into the dressing room mirror, adjusting the jeweled black jumpsuit hanging perfectly from his shoulders. The rhinestones reflected every light in the room, yet his eyes seemed far away. Charlie Hodge stepped inside. "They're louder than I've ever heard." Elvis smiled faintly. "They're cheering for someone they remember." Charlie frowned. "They're cheering for you." Elvis didn't answer. Instead, he quietly picked up a folded newspaper lying on the table. The headline was impossible to ignore. "Is the king losing his crown?" Another article called him outdated. Another mocked his weight. Another claimed younger artists had already replaced him. Elvis folded the paper without saying a word. He had learned something long ago. The loudest critics usually knew the least about the battles a person fought in silence. Someone knocked on the dressing room door. "5 minutes, Elvis." He nodded. As everyone hurried around preparing for one of the biggest concerts of the year, Elvis remained strangely calm. He closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he wasn't standing in New York. He was back in Tupelo, a shy little boy wearing worn-out shoes. A boy whose parents struggled to pay bills. A boy who never imagined that one day 20,000 strangers would scream his name. He whispered to himself, "Don't forget where you came from." Then he stood. The king was ready. The roar inside Madison Square Garden exploded into something almost impossible to describe. Spotlights swept across the arena. Smoke drifted across the stage. The orchestra struck the opening notes. Then he appeared. The crowd erupted so violently that the first few seconds of music disappeared beneath waves of screams. Women cried instantly. Men climbed onto their chairs. Security guards exchanged nervous looks. Elvis simply smiled. There was something almost magical about the way he moved. Not rushed, not forced. Every step carried confidence built over decades of standing beneath impossible expectations. He raised one hand. The audience somehow became even louder. For nearly 2 hours he gave everything he had. Song after song, smile after smile, joke after joke. He pointed toward children sitting on their parents' shoulders. He accepted flowers tossed onto the stage, scarves, letters, small handmade gifts. He never hurried past them, because Elvis understood something many celebrities forgot. For every person in the audience, this wasn't just another concert. It might become the greatest memory of their lives. Near the front barricade stood a young woman named Claire. She looked to be around 30. Unlike everyone around her, she wasn't smiling. She hadn't clapped once. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, while thousands of fans around her sang every lyric. The woman beside her noticed. "First Elvis concert?" Claire nodded. "You'll love it." Claire forced a weak smile. "We'll see." The woman laughed. "Oh, trust me." But Claire's eyes never left the stage, not with admiration, with something much heavier. Bitterness, hidden pain, a sadness that had slowly turned into anger. No one around her knew why she was there. Not even she fully understood. Months earlier, her husband had promised they would attend an Elvis concert together. He bought the tickets as a surprise. "It's our second honeymoon," he had joked. But life had different plans. A sudden heart attack took him before the concert date arrived. Claire couldn't bring herself to throw away the tickets. She came alone. Every love song hurt. Every smile from the audience reminded her of what she had lost. By the time Elvis reached the middle of his performance, her grief had quietly transformed into resentment. She looked at the man everyone adored. How could he smile so easily when her own world had ended? On stage, Elvis noticed faces the way other performers noticed lights. He saw joy, excitement, hope, children waving homemade signs, couples dancing, parents holding babies. Then, he noticed one face that didn't belong. The woman in the denim jacket. She wasn't singing. She wasn't applauding. She looked angry. Not the kind of anger directed at him personally. The kind carried by someone exhausted from fighting life itself. Elvis continued singing, but every few moments his eyes drifted back toward her. Something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it. He simply felt it. Years of performing had taught him that crowds had personalities, and every now and then, one face told a story louder than 20,000 voices. The concert reached another emotional peak. Thunderous applause echoed through Madison Square Garden. Elvis walked toward the long runway extending into the audience. Security moved closer. Fans leaned over the barricades, hands stretched desperately toward him. Some only wanted a handshake. Others hoped to touch his sleeve. Several burst into tears before he even reached them. Claire remained still as Elvis slowly approached. Their eyes met. For only a second, yet it felt strangely personal. Elvis smiled gently. Most fans would have melted instantly. Claire didn't. Instead, something inside her finally broke. Years of buried grief, sleepless nights, hospital memories, funeral silence, loneliness. Everything exploded at once. Before anyone could stop her, she shouted loudly enough for nearby sections to hear. "So this is your kingdom?" The music stopped. A ripple of confusion spread across the arena. Thousands of heads turned. Security immediately stepped forward. Claire wasn't finished. She pointed directly at Elvis. "They call you the king." Her voice shook, not with confidence, but with heartbreak. "But crowns don't mean anything to people who lose everything." The arena fell into absolute silence. No music, no cheers, only 20,000 people holding their breath. Security reached for the barricade. One guard quietly spoke into his radio. Another prepared to escort the woman away. The cameras remained fixed on Elvis. Everyone expected one of two things. Either security would remove her immediately, or Elvis would ignore her completely. Instead, he slowly lifted one white-gloved hand. Not toward Claire, toward security. A simple gesture. "Stop." The guards froze. Elvis looked directly into the woman's tear-filled eyes. He didn't look angry. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked concerned. Without saying a single word, he slowly stepped down from the edge of the stage, and the entire arena watched in stunned silence as Elvis Presley walked toward the woman who had just challenged him in front of 20,000 people. No one could have imagined what would happen next. Elvis stepped off the stage so slowly that for a moment the audience wondered if time itself had paused. The lights continued to shine, but the music had vanished. Only the faint hum of amplifiers filled Madison Square Garden. More than 20,000 people watched in complete silence. Security guards instinctively moved closer, creating a protective circle around Elvis. Their training told them to remove the woman immediately. Their experience told them that unpredictable moments inside a concert could become dangerous within seconds. But Elvis lifted his white-gloved hand once again. No. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. That single word carried enough authority to stop every guard in their tracks. The arena remained frozen. Claire stood motionless behind the barricade, breathing heavily. Only a few seconds earlier, she had wanted to yell. Now she wasn't even sure why she had spoken. She looked into Elvis's eyes for the first time, not through binoculars, not on television, not on magazine covers, face to face. She expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even humiliation. Instead, she saw kindness, real kindness, the kind that catches people off guard because they no longer believe it exists. Elvis rested one knee on the edge of the stage, bringing himself almost to her eye level. He smiled softly. "What is your name, honey?" His southern accent sounded warm, almost fatherly. Claire hesitated. Around her, thousands of strangers stared in complete silence. Her voice cracked. "My name is Claire." Elvis nodded slowly. "That's a beautiful name." Claire looked away. "I don't deserve kindness." Those words landed heavier than the accusation she had shouted moments earlier. Elvis noticed something everyone else had missed. Her eyes weren't filled with hatred. They were filled with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes after crying alone for months. He leaned a little closer. "Who hurt you?" The question was so gentle that Claire almost didn't hear it. Nobody had asked her that in a very long time. Instead, people kept saying the same things. "You'll get over it. Time heals everything. You need to move on." She hated those sentences. Time hadn't healed anything. It had only taught her how to hide the pain better. Elvis waited. He didn't rush her. He simply stayed there. One superstar. One grieving woman. 20,000 silent witnesses. Finally, Claire whispered, "My husband." The words barely escaped her lips. Elvis's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. "I'm sorry." She laughed bitterly. "No, you couldn't possibly be." The audience remained silent, hanging on every word. "My husband loved you." She swallowed hard. "He played your records every Sunday morning." A faint smile appeared despite the tears. "He couldn't sing." A few people in the audience chuckled quietly. Claire almost smiled too. Every note was wrong. Another gentle wave of laughter spread through the crowd. But he never cared. Her smile disappeared. "He bought these tickets 6 months ago." She reached into her jacket pocket with trembling hands. From inside, she carefully unfolded 2 worn concert tickets. One had been torn at the entrance, the other remained untouched. She held them toward Elvis. "He said this would be our second honeymoon." Her voice completely broke. "But—" She couldn't finish. The silence became unbearable. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures. Nobody wanted to interrupt this moment. Elvis looked at the untouched ticket, then back at Claire. "When did he pass?" 3 months ago." She finally burst into tears, not quiet tears. Years of suppressed grief poured out all at once. "I didn't want to come. I hated this place. I hated this concert. I hated everyone smiling. She pointed toward the audience. I hated hearing people laugh. She looked directly at Elvis. And I hated you. Gasps echoed across nearby sections. Claire covered her mouth immediately. I know. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't your fault. She shook uncontrollably. I didn't know where else to put all this pain. Elvis never interrupted. Not once. He simply listened. Sometimes listening is the greatest gift a person can give. After nearly a minute, Claire wiped her eyes. You know what makes me angry? Elvis quietly asked. What? My husband never got to hear you live. She held up the unused ticket again. It belonged to him. Another long silence. Then Elvis asked something no one expected. What was his name? Claire looked surprised. Daniel. Elvis repeated it softly. Daniel. As though he wanted to remember it forever. He looked upward for a brief second. Then back at Claire. What kind of man was Daniel? This time, her tears changed. Instead of crying from pain, she began remembering. He worked too much. A tiny smile appeared. He always forgot where he left his car keys. The audience laughed gently. He made terrible coffee. Another ripple of laughter. But every Friday, she smiled wider, he brought flowers home. No reason. Just flowers. Elvis smiled too. What else? He volunteered at the Veterans Hospital. What else? He called his mother every Sunday. What else? He danced in the kitchen whenever your songs came on. Claire laughed through tears. He embarrassed me every single time. For the first time that evening, she wasn't talking about death. She was talking about life. Elvis knew exactly what he was doing. Pain keeps people trapped in the final chapter. Healing begins when someone helps them remember the pages that came before. He looked toward the audience. Folks, his voice echoed gently through Madison Square Garden. I think Daniel sounds like the kind of man we'd all be proud to know. The crowd answered with thunderous applause. Not for Elvis, for a man they had never met. Claire looked around in disbelief. 20,000 strangers were clapping for her husband. She covered her face again, this time, not because she was broken, because she had never imagined his name would be spoken inside Madison Square Garden. The applause slowly faded. Elvis turned back toward her. You know something? Claire shook her head. I don't think Daniel's seat is empty tonight. She frowned. Elvis pointed gently toward her heart. I think he's been sitting there the whole concert. Claire completely lost control of her emotions. She cried harder than before. Around the arena, hundreds of people wiped tears from their own eyes. Even several security guards quietly looked away. Backstage, members of the TCB band stood frozen. No one had rehearsed this. No one could have. Then Elvis slowly stood to his feet. He looked toward his musicians, raised one finger, and softly said, "Stay ready." The band members exchanged confused glances. Elvis turned back toward Claire. There is something I'd like to do. The audience leaned forward. No one knew what was coming next, but everyone could feel that the night was about to become something far greater than a concert. Elvis stood motionless for a few seconds, his eyes never leaving Claire's. The arena remained wrapped in complete silence. Not the awkward silence of confusion. The sacred silence that appears only when thousands of people realize they are witnessing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Then, Elvis reached into the inside pocket of his black jumpsuit. The audience watched every movement. He pulled out a neatly folded white handkerchief. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't decorated with rhinestones. It was simply the same handkerchief he always carried during concerts. He offered it to Claire, without saying a word. Claire hesitated before taking it. Her hands trembled. I don't deserve this." Elvis smiled. "None of us deserve grace." His answer spread through the arena like a gentle wave. Several people in the audience lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped tears from their own cheeks. Elvis glanced toward the untouched concert ticket, still resting in Claire's hand. "May I see it?" She nodded. Carefully, she placed the unused ticket into his white-gloved hand. Elvis studied it for several seconds. The date, the seat number, everything Daniel had once imagined. He slowly turned it over. The back of the ticket was completely blank. Elvis looked toward Charlie Hodge, who stood quietly near the side of the stage. "Charlie." Charlie immediately hurried over. "Sir?" "Do you have a pen?" Charlie reached into his jacket and handed him one without asking why. Elvis uncapped it. Then, on the back of Daniel's unused ticket, he slowly began writing. No cameras could see the words. The audience waited. Claire watched every movement. Several long seconds passed. Finally, Elvis folded the ticket once again. He handed it back to Claire. "For you." She looked confused. "What did you write?" Elvis gently shook his head. "Read it after the show." Claire held the ticket against her heart. She had no idea that those few handwritten words would become the most valuable thing she owned for the rest of her life. Elvis stepped back onto the stage, but he didn't pick up the microphone immediately. Instead, he looked across the faces filling Madison Square Garden. 20,000 strangers, 20,000 different stories, 20,000 hidden battles. He slowly spoke. "When I was a little boy in Tupelo," his voice echoed softly through the arena, "my mama used to tell me something." He paused. She said, "Elvis, you never know what someone carried into the room before they smiled at you." He looked toward Claire. "I've tried to remember that every day of my life." Another pause. "Sometimes people don't need judgment. They need someone willing to hear the pain hiding behind their words." Nobody applauded. Nobody wanted to interrupt him. He continued. "Tonight, I think we all learned something." He smiled gently. "The loudest voice isn't always the angriest. Sometimes it's simply the most broken." Those words settled over the audience like rain after a long drought. Even photographers stopped pressing their camera shutters. Some moments deserved to exist without interruption. Elvis turned toward the orchestra. "Glenn," the guitarist, looked up. "Let's change the set list." The musicians exchanged surprised glances. Nothing like this had been planned. The printed program lying backstage suddenly meant nothing. Charlie quietly smiled. He had traveled with Elvis long enough to recognize that look. Whenever Elvis followed his heart instead of the schedule, magic usually happened. Elvis picked up the microphone once again. "This next song," he looked toward Claire, "isn't for one person. It's for everyone who's ever walked into a room carrying pain nobody else could see." A few people immediately began crying again. Elvis nodded gently toward the pianist. One soft note filled the arena. Then another. The orchestra slowly joined. No dramatic entrance, no explosive opening, only quiet music floating through the darkness. Elvis closed his eyes before singing the first line. His voice carried a different weight now. It wasn't the powerful voice of a superstar. It sounded like the voice of an old friend sitting beside someone in their darkest hour. Every lyric seemed to find people who had spent years hiding behind smiles. A man in the upper balcony quietly reached for his wife's hand. An elderly woman pressed a faded photograph against her chest. A young soldier home on leave lowered his head. Near the front, Claire stood completely still. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she wasn't fighting her grief. She was allowing herself to feel it. There is a difference. One slowly destroys you, the other slowly heals you. Halfway through the song, something unexpected happened. Someone in the audience began holding up a small lighter, then another, another. Within seconds, tiny points of light appeared throughout Madison Square Garden. Soon, thousands. The arena looked less like a concert hall and more like a sky filled with stars. Nobody had asked them to do it. No announcement had been made. The moment simply happened. Even Elvis looked surprised. He smiled without missing a lyric. The lights reflected in his eyes as he looked across the sea of glowing flames. Claire turned around. She gasped. Everywhere she looked, light. People who had entered the arena as strangers now shared one silent act of compassion. Some were crying openly. Others embraced family members beside them. One father quietly lifted his young daughter onto his shoulders so she could see above the crowd. The child whispered, "Why is everyone crying?" Her father answered softly, "Because sometimes music helps people say the things words can't." Claire heard him. She closed her eyes. Daniel used to say almost the exact same thing. A memory suddenly returned with perfect clarity. Years earlier, she and Daniel had danced barefoot in their tiny kitchen while an Elvis record played on an old turntable. They laughed because the record skipped in the middle of every chorus. Instead of buying a new one, Daniel always said, "It isn't broken. It just has its own rhythm." Claire laughed through her tears. For months, every memory had brought unbearable pain. Tonight, for the first time, a memory made her smile. As the final note echoed through Madison Square Garden, nobody moved, not even for a second. The silence returned, but this silence was different. It no longer carried sorrow, it carried gratitude. Elvis lowered the microphone. He looked toward Claire once more. She placed one hand over her heart. Then, without speaking, she mouthed two simple words. "Thank you." Elvis nodded. No words were necessary. Then something extraordinary happened. One person stood, then another, then another. Within moments, every single person inside Madison Square Garden was on their feet. More than 20,000 people rose together in one uninterrupted standing ovation. The applause grew louder and louder until it became almost deafening. It wasn't applause for a performance, it was applause for compassion, for forgiveness, for reminding thousands of people that kindness could still exist in a world that often forgot it. Elvis stood quietly, his head slightly bowed. He accepted none of the applause as his own. Instead, he slowly turned toward Claire, and with one gentle gesture, he invited the entire arena to applaud her, for finding the courage to tell the truth about her pain, for surviving, and for choosing, at last, to begin healing. Claire broke down once more, but these were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release, tears that had waited months for permission to fall. And yet, Before the night was over, Elvis had one final surprise waiting for her, one that no one inside Madison Square Garden could have imagined. The applause refused to end. 1 minute passed, then another. Still, the audience remained on its feet. Some people were cheering, others were simply crying. Even members of the TCB band looked at one another with expressions that said the same thing. They had never witnessed a concert like this. Elvis waited patiently. He had spent his entire career hearing applause, but tonight it sounded different. This wasn't admiration, it was gratitude. When the cheering finally softened, Elvis raised the microphone once more. "I've been blessed with a lot of beautiful nights," he smiled at the crowd, "but I don't think I'll ever forget this one." The audience answered with another wave of applause. Elvis chuckled softly. "You folks are making it hard for an old country boy to keep his composure." Laughter spread across the arena, easing the emotion just enough for everyone to breathe again. Then Elvis looked toward Claire. "I've got one favor to ask." Claire looked startled. "Would you come up here?" The entire arena gasped. Security carefully opened the barricade. Claire immediately shook her head. "No," she whispered through tears. "I can't." Elvis smiled warmly. "Yes, you can." The crowd began clapping gently, not to pressure her, but to encourage her. One step, then another. Claire slowly walked toward the stage. Her legs felt weak. She had entered Madison Square Garden believing she would leave with anger. Instead, she was walking onto the same stage where Elvis Presley had made music history. When she reached him, Elvis helped her step onto the platform. The audience erupted once more. Claire covered her face, overwhelmed. "I've never been in front of this many people." Elvis laughed. "Neither had I. The first time." The crowd smiled. For a brief moment, the fear disappeared. Elvis turned toward the audience. "I want everybody to meet Claire." 20,000 people applauded. Then he continued, "And tonight, I'd also like you to meet someone else." Claire looked at him confused. Elvis gently held up the untouched ticket Daniel had never been able to use. "This seat," he said quietly, "was meant for a man named Daniel." The arena became silent again. "I never had the privilege of meeting him. But from everything Claire told us, he sounds like the kind of husband every family hopes for." Elvis looked around the arena. "So tonight, I'd like all of us to do something together." He removed the white scarf from around his neck. It was damp with sweat from the performance. Every Elvis fan knew what those scarves meant. People treasured them for decades, sometimes generations. He carefully folded it, then placed it gently into Claire's hands. "I've given away a lot of scarves," he smiled, "but I don't think I've ever known exactly where one belonged until tonight." Claire looked down at it in disbelief. Her hands trembled. "I can't accept this." Elvis softly closed her fingers around it. "You already have." Then Elvis surprised everyone. He walked toward the piano, not the center microphone, not the spotlight, just the piano. He quietly spoke to the pianist. "One more." The pianist nodded, without rehearsal, without announcement, without even mentioning the title. A soft melody began filling the arena. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Every note carried tenderness. Elvis sang as though he were speaking directly to one person, not to 20,000, to one grieving heart. Claire closed her eyes. She imagined Daniel standing beside her. not because she believed he had somehow returned, but because love has a way of making memories feel present. She remembered the first time they met, the awkward first dance, their tiny apartment, burned dinners, Sunday mornings filled with Elvis records spinning on an old record player, arguments that ended with laughter, road trips with no destination, rainy afternoons spent doing absolutely nothing. The ordinary moments, the ones people never realize are extraordinary until they're gone. For months, every memory had felt like a knife. Tonight, they felt like gifts. When the song ended, Elvis didn't bow. Instead, he walked back toward Claire. "I wrote something on that ticket." She nodded. "I want you to read it now." Her hands shook as she unfolded the ticket. The arena was so quiet that even the paper could be heard. She turned it over. Written neatly across the back were the words, "Love never leaves with the one who is gone. It lives on in the heart of the one who remembers. Elvis." Claire stared at the message. Then the tears came again. But this time, they were peaceful, not desperate, not hopeless. She looked up at Elvis. "I thought I came here to say goodbye to my husband." Her voice echoed softly through the arena. She smiled through tears. "But tonight," I remembered, "I never have to." A wave of emotion swept through Madison Square Garden. People embraced one another. Complete strangers held hands. Even hardened security guards wiped away tears they hoped no one would notice. As the concert drew to a close, Elvis stepped to the edge of the stage one final time. He looked across the sea of faces. "I've sung a lot of songs in my life," he paused, "but music isn't the greatest gift God gave us." The audience listened carefully. "The greatest gift," he looked toward Claire, "is the ability to remind another person they're not alone." Silence. If you leave this building tonight and you see someone carrying pain, be kind. You never know how close they are to giving up. Those words settled into every corner of the arena. Nobody applauded immediately. Some messages deserve silence before celebration. Then the applause returned, louder than at any other moment that night. It rolled through Madison Square Garden like thunder. Years later, people would remember Elvis's historic 1972 performances. They would remember the songs, the jumpsuit, the standing ovations. But those who had been there that evening always told a different story. They didn't begin with the music. They began with a grieving woman who shouted at Elvis Presley, and a man who could have answered with pride but chose compassion instead. Claire kept the white scarf for the rest of her life. The ticket with Elvis's handwritten message remained framed beside a photograph of Daniel in her living room. Whenever visitors asked why those two simple objects meant so much, she smiled and answered the same way every time. That night, Elvis didn't just sing to an audience. He rescued a heart that had forgotten how to heal. And perhaps that was the greatest performance Elvis Presley never planned. Not because it made headlines, not because it became famous, but because, for one unforgettable night in June of 1972, the king of rock and roll reminded 20,000 people that kindness is often the most powerful song a human being can ever perform.